Hi students, today we are looking at reproduction in plants. So reproduction by definition is whereby you have got an organism and this organism is able to produce others of its own species. So why is this important is to ensure that there is a continuity of the species and the species does not die off. So asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction for plants. So in humans, obviously there cannot be asexual reproduction. So in plants and some organisms like bacteria, fungi, uh, are able to undergo asexual reproduction, whereby it is genetically identical. Okay, that means, for example, if I have got a potato offspring using asexual method of reproduction, then the mama potato and the baby potato will have the exact same genetic information. So this involves only mitosis. Okay, so under cell division, we have got two types of reproduction. So asexual only involve mitosis, whereby there is two identical daughter cells. There's no such thing as a son cell. So it is only daughter cell with the same number of chromosome, exactly the same amount of genetic information. So the daughter cells and the parental cell will have identical hereditary materials, which is essentially the DNA. So in sexual reproduction, you have got gametes, aka also known as sex cells. So you have got the ovum, which is the egg cell, and also the sperm cell. So during fusion, okay, sexual reproduction, we always need to use the term fusion. So during fusion, a zygote is then subsequently formed. So this formation of the zygote is not genetically identical. So the upside of this is that this sexual reproduction, you will have genetically different. So later we will see that how these genetically different offsprings are able to have a better shot of life compared to asexual reproduction, the pros and cons of both. So unlike asexual, which is mitosis, sexual reproduction only involves meiosis. So same thing, daughter cells, I have got haploid. So if you compare this, I have got identical daughter cells, same number of chromosomes. On the other hand, this is haploid, that means half the number of chromosomes. Subsequently, during fertilization, this half number of chromosome will then undergo fertilization with another cell, another gamete cell, to restore back to gamete. So for example, in humans, haploid number, we have got 23 chromosomes. When 23 chromosomes in the sperm cell fuses during fertilization with 23 chromosomes in the ovum cell, subsequently it is restored back to 46. So it cannot have an original number of 46, otherwise you're going to have double, and double is not always a good thing. Okay, so moving on, you have got the different parts of the plant, all of which you must be able to identify. So you can see that this is a petal. So this is more for insect pollinated flowers. Okay, insect pollinated flowers need to attract insects. So it has to be brightly colored. Sometimes it has got nice scents, like for example, roses, to bring the insects into the flower itself. So you have got wind pollinated as well. So these don't require insects. So they have very dull, unscented petals. Okay, so over here, the male reproductive organ, you have got the stamen. So stamen is made up of two parts, the filament and the anther. So you can see this part over here, this whole thing is the male reproductive, this whole thing is the female reproductive component. So in the male reproductive component, you have got the anther at the top, the filament at the bottom to actually hold the anther up. So filament over here, just long stem-like structures to position the anther, okay, to enable the pollen grains to be pollinated. So meiosis will take place to produce the male gametes in what is known as pollen, similar to sperm cells. Okay, so all these are more of additional information. So each pollen grain has two nucleus, plural 10. So these two nucleus, when you break it up, is generative nucleus and pollen loop nucleus, pollen tube nucleus. Okay, so haploid cells from the male gametes will same thing, fuse with the haploid or female ovum during fertilization. So anthers, in order to produce the pollen grains, you need a huge amount of sugars and energy. So all this is required by transportation So we got the phloem and the xylem. So the phloem transports mainly sugar for energy. The xylem transports water and minerals. So receptacle that you have over here at the bottom, okay, it was like a little bud. So generally over time, this receptacle can now become subsequently the fleshy and edible part of the fruit. Okay, sepal is not really useful as the plant grows or the flower grows, but when it was a baby bud, the sepal will protect the flower before the blooming of it. Okay, nectary is only in insect pollinated flowers to produce the nectar to actually attract the insects itself for transferring the pollen grains from flower to flower. So carpel over here, female reproductive organ. So you have got the ovary, style, and stigma. So when we look at here, you have got the stigma at the top, which is where the pollen grain lands. I have got the style, same thing, the pollen grain to hold the stigma up, and also the pollen grain upon fertilization will travel down the style towards the ovaries and the ovules for fertilization. Okay, so these pollen grains attach onto the sticky region, and with the attachment, the presence of the stickiness, the germination of the pollen grains will be stimulated. So once it is stimulated, later on we will see what happens during fertilization. Okay, so ovary attaches to the receptacle, so it will protect the ovules. The ovules inside contains the female gametes, which are the ovum or plural tense ova. Okay, and this part is what is known as the definitive nucleus, because that's where fertilization takes place. So when we look at pollination over here, definition you do have to know transfer. Specific term is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Okay, so when pollen grains they are transferred, okay, this part very important. So when pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or different flower of the same plant, that means it is, for example, hibiscus to hibiscus, then self-pollination. Okay, so if it is transferred to another plant of the same kind, this one is called cross-pollination. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages of self and cross-pollination. So self-pollination is very advantageous, whereby you don't have wind on insects. So wind and insects, they are like agents needed for transferring of the pollen grains. So lesser energy, you don't need to attract insects. Wind, of course, you are not attracting. This is more due to environment. So it's more adapted. Okay, if that specific species is very adapted to the area, then this self-pollination will enable them to keep the favorable trait and colonize the entire area. Okay, the disadvantage, however, is that because the genes are pretty much similar throughout generation, so if there is a slight change in the environmental condition and these self-pollinated plants do not have traits to adapt to the changes, it can potentially wipe out the entire species in that region. Okay, cross-pollination increases genetic variation, so that enables them to have more advantages, more adaptability. But of course, during this genetic variation in their fertilization process, some advantageous trait can be destroyed because it's not guaranteed that all the good traits is 100% going to be passed on to the next generation. And you have to rely on effective cross-pollination, so which means animal, insect population, wind, all plays a role. Okay, so when you look at wind pollinated versus insect pollinated, you can see the big difference here. Insect pollinated, I have got the petals, I have got the nectar guide. So this nectar guide will actually guide the insect down towards the nectary itself, and during the process of coming down all these nectar guides, okay, it can brush past the anther, and then subsequently some pollen grains can land onto the insect, and after the insect takes the nectar itself, it can then fly off to the next flower and hopefully transfer some of the pollen onto that particular flower. Okay, in a wind pollinated flower, you can see that the petals, they are just very loose, it's not required. The stigma is extremely loose and feathery, just just hanging out, able to be hanging out. Similarly, the filaments in some, they are hanging loose instead of being held upright. Okay, so these are some of the differences between the wind pollinated and insect pollinated. So petals, inconspicuous, really small. Okay, insect is really large and conspicuous. Okay, nectary guide, wind pollinated, we don't need insects, so it's absent. Pollen for wind pollinated is in large quantities because it has to be able to fly through the air. During the process of flying through the air, that's when some of it is going to drop to the ground, to the grass fields, and it might not make it to the area that it needs to fertilize. So in order to increase the chances, you need very large quantities. Okay, small and dry in order to fly through the wind. So in some countries that have got 4 seasons, during the spring period, that's when a lot of pollen is in the air and people have some allergic reactions to the pollen grains. So in insect pollinated, you have smaller quantities because you just need a few of them to actually land onto the insect, but to ensure that it sticks on it, it has to be larger in size and sticky as well. So anthers and stigma we saw just now, they are large and loosely placed outside. Stigma as well. Okay, so these feathery components enable the wind to dislodge them rather than being enclosed. Okay, last but not least, we will take a look at the fertilization part. So once there is a pollen grain that lands onto the stigma, pollination will then take place. So during the process of pollination, that's when you got fertilization. So when we look at the two components over here, okay, so you have got the mature pollen grain. So just now we mentioned that during that period, I have got inside the pollen, I have got two types of nucleus, the pollen tube nucleus and the generative nucleus. So once the pollen itself lands onto the stigma, okay, there is a very sugary component over here which leads to the maturation of the pollen. So the maturation of the pollen will then lead to the development of a pollen tube. Okay, so this pollen tube, what it does is that throughout this entire area, okay, in the stigma, you need to be able to transfer the pollen grain down, but I have got a style over here. So what happens is that the pollen tube that is developed will then secrete the enzymes. So these enzymes, it will then digest and break down all the surrounding tissues of the stigma and the style. So once it breaks down, it will then go down the entire style, so my pollen can actually travel down over here, and along the way the pollen tube nucleus, which is this one, will degenerate. Okay, so subsequently as it moves down, the generative nucleus, which is the second nucleus in the pollen, will then develop into 2 male gametes. So with this, it will then enter into the ovule region. So inside the ovule region, the first few gamete will then be fused with the ovum to form a zygote. Second male gamete will fuse with the definitive nucleus to form an endosperm nucleus. So this zygote, subsequently similar to human zygote, will then form the embryo. Endosperm nucleus will then form the endosperm, which is the food storage tissue. Okay, remember the plant, as after fertilization, it doesn't have external sources of energy. There's no mother that is going to be so-called feeding the little seed. Okay, so what it needs to have food storage. So that's where the endosperm nucleus will develop into the endosperm. So subsequently, the ovary will develop into the fruit, and last but not least, the ovule will develop into the seed, and that's when it will then have storage component and can develop into a fruit. Okay, thank you for watching.